It's terrible when you hire a candidate who's great at interviewing, but not at the job you hired them for. My name is John Seifer, and I've owned companies all my adult life. Since 1994, I've helped other business owners learn from my mistakes at CEObootcamp.com. I once talked to a startup founder who told me 9 out of his first 10 hires were no longer with the company. What's different about the one who stayed? I asked. I didn't hire them, he said. Today I'm going to share some tools and some tips so you won't be that guy. Strap in and let's get started. The 4 parts to a successful hiring are defining what you want, discovering the candidates, deciding on the candidate, and then onboarding them. We focused on defining what you want in the first video, hiring part 1. And then we're going to use that definition of what you came up with in deciding who to hire. In part 2, we learned how to find candidates, and we talked about the filter in your application process. That filter is actually the initial aspect of deciding who to hire. Anyone who didn't pass the filter is automatically out of the running. So here's tool number 1, and that is forget the interview. Yes, you heard that right, unless you're hiring someone to be a permanent interviewee. Would you hire a chef without having them cook for you just because of how they interviewed? And ideally, you'd like it if they would cook in your kitchen with your tools. So the best way to test an applicant's skill and how they fit in with your team is to have them do some work for you. This is not always possible, of course, but it's worth trying to get creative about it. Here are some ideas. Internships are great for younger people. Obviously, you have to pay them, and you want them to do some real work, not just get coffee and make copies and hang around. The added benefit here is that you get to see them interact with your team. And an internship is usually long enough that the honeymoon phase of good behavior kind of wears off and you see who they really are. If you like them, but for some reason you can't hire them because maybe they need to go back and finish school, you can make them part of your farm team, which we talked about in the part 2 video. Another way people have used the try before you buy approach is to hire candidates to do some project work. Hire them on a contract basis to do something you need done. This works great for standalone projects like graphic design, and it should be something that's big enough to be useful, and make sure you own the rights to their work in the contract. But it should be short enough that if they don't do it well, you haven't wasted too much money. But you've probably wasted a lot less than you would waste on a bad hire. This one's a little different. It tests the candidate's ability, but also gives them a chance to see how well they like the job. I learned about this from a company who had bread routes where they had guys in trucks delivering bread to store, and each driver had a truck and had their own route. They required that the candidate spend a week working with one of their drivers on their truck. Candidates usually had to take vacation time from their current job to do this. This also tested the candidate's commitment. As I said, none of these may apply to you, and you have to get creative on this. Maybe you could hire them to do a writing piece or a bit of computer code or something tangible that could be useful. As someone said, if you want good people, hiring is a full contact sport. Try to make the engagement as close to the real world as you can. For example, don't expect them to know things off the top of their head that in their real job they'd be able to look them up. But do expect them to show the ability to look things up quickly and determine the validity of an online source if that's important. One watered-down example of this is the whiteboarding exercise that's common in hiring programmers. Part of the interview, they're asked to go up to a whiteboard and show how they'd write code to solve a problem. As you can see, it's not really the real-world environment, but at least it's an attempt to see how somebody works. Tool number 2. It is the interview. Sometimes you just can't avoid doing an interview, but make sure you don't do it wrong. The biggest mistake people make in interviewing is going with their gut. This is not a decision about who you'd like to have a beer with. Here's how to do it right. And before we go further, I have to say I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an HR professional. There are laws about what you can and can't say or ask in a job candidate. Many of these vary from one area to another, and be sure to consult somebody who's familiar with your local regulations. The general rule is you can only ask about things that are relevant to the job. So you can't ask if they go to church, but you can ask if they're available to work on Sundays if that's required. You can't ask about someone's health, but you can ask if they're physically capable of standing on their feet all day or lifting 25 pounds overhead if those are requirements for the job. You generally can't ask about marital status or family plans, like I said, just things that are absolutely required for the job. There's a guy named Daniel Kahneman who has written a terrific book about how people make decisions, not specifically about hiring, but just in general. It turns out there are two distinct ways ideas come to mind. He calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is your gut instinct. It's great where speed is important and the cost of being wrong is low. Deciding on a candidate is neither of these. There's a lot of research on interviews where the interviewer actually forms an impression of the interviewee within the first 3 minutes and spends the rest of the interview confirming that impression that they've already made. That's a waste of time. You can't exactly turn off your gut, but you can engage System 2 in your interviewing process. Here's how. Get out the hiring canvas that you did in the video on hiring in Part 1. In part of that hiring canvas, you have described the things that you want that person to bring to your company. Specifically, you want a list of the character traits, skills, and other things that are absolutely required in the candidate you want to hire. Then you make an interview scorecard for that person. And you separate the requirements from the nice to have. And for each requirement, you make a specific way to test them or to determine them. So some of it might be a whiteboard test. Some of it might be some kind of behavioral interview, which we'll get to in a minute. You may divvy these up, so some people will work on requirements 1, 2, and 3, and somebody else would work on 4, 5, and 6. The point here is that you score the person on each requirement one at a time. You don't want to reach a global conclusion about the candidate till the very end. You want to reach a conclusion about each requirement separately. You're trying to delay your intuition, and then you make a global judgment. One of the ways to test for character traits is often called behavioral interview questions. It would be things like, tell me about a time when you had a project go sideways and what did you do about it? The trick to these is you really want to get into the depth of it. If somebody starts to give you, you ask that question, let's say about a project that went sideways, and they start to give you kind of vague, pablum kind of responses, dig down into how did it go? What did they do next? How did they discuss it with that person? How did they get their boss on board? And really get into the details and the nitty-gritty. But what you're really doing is looking for the character traits that you have listed and that you're requiring to be in somebody who you want to give this job to. So, for example, if you're looking for a team player, you would not ask as a behavioral interview question, tell me about a time when you were a team player. Because guess what? You're going to get stories about that. You could ask about almost anything else. Tell me about your worst job, your first job, your last job, your best job. Tell me about the time, did you ever make a surprise party for a friend of yours? And as they tell you about those things, you are looking for how much they were a team player or how much they were an individual superstar, which might be a character trait important for a different kind of job. So that's how you do these behavioral interview questions. And you have to think through the right question ahead of time based on the character trait that you're looking for. Be sure to Google somebody that's a candidate. Look them up on LinkedIn. If they have a teaching position, look them up on their school teaching or some of their other company website stuff. And don't neglect this. This was not about a job candidate, but it was a guy I knew sort of peripherally in some of the organizations I was with. And one day I just decided to Google him, and a couple of pictures came up, and one of them I thought, man, that looks like a mugshot. Sure enough, it was. He had been arrested, and it was just an interesting point of view. So if it was a job candidate, I would definitely want to be aware of that. And there are times when you might want to hire somebody who's had a criminal record and you want to give them another chance, but you certainly want to be able to know if they're being truthful about it, stuff like that. And I have to talk about personality tests. It would be wonderful if we could have a magic test that would automatically say this person is qualified or not qualified, this is a good fit for this position, not a good fit. The jury is out on the academic studies about whether personality tests work or not. There's a lot of people that swear by them. There's a lot of research that says they're not really that much different than horoscopes, and that they do tend to change over time, even for the same person. If you want to use one of these, here's what would be the best case scenario. if you had a position where you had 2 or 3 people who were great at that position, and you had 2 or 3 people in your company who are lousy at that position, and you give the same personality test to all of them and see if there's any correlation between how they score on the test and how they do in the real job. When you have multiple people doing interviews, sometimes you have divvied up the requirements and this person is looking for these 2 or 3 and that person is looking for those. Sometimes you have everybody looking at everything and you just want to get different opinions. The key to making this work is it's important that they don't talk to each other until the end. You don't want to get groupthink. You don't want to get the other interviewers affecting their opinion. So they each have their own separate score sheet. They put down their notes, and then they should make their own decision independently and then discuss. Now, it's up to you and your company and your culture, etc., if the discussion becomes a consensus and everybody has to agree, or if it's just a discussion and one person is known that they will be making the final decision. If that's the case, the person who's making the final decision should speak last, again, so you don't influence the ideas of the others. Here's tool number 3. And this is something you should say in the interview. And that is, when I talk to your references, what will I hear? You don't want to say if, you want to say when. This gives them the impression, which should be true, that you are going to check their references. The other thing you're looking for here is, what are you going to ask the references? So you might say to somebody, when I talk to your references, what will they tell me about the kinds of teams you work best with or the kinds of teams you work worst with? And in addition to the answer that you're getting, you're looking for how self-aware that person is, if that self-awareness is important for the job. Some of jobs it's more important than others. You would like to see that what they tell you the references will say actually matches up with what the references do say, if that's important. You can also ask, when you call the references, obviously you will get people, they will give you names of people who like them. So you can ask those people for some other names of people that this person worked with and call them as secondary or tertiary references. You can look up who they worked with on LinkedIn and maybe reach out to some people whose names they didn't give you to find that. There are companies who will only be allowed to tell you, yes, this is the date this person worked here, and maybe this is the date they left, and perhaps this is their last job title that they held. One voicemail trick that I heard, I've never done it, but it sounded very interesting to me, is you can call somebody at a time when you expect to get their voicemail. So maybe it's in the evening, maybe it's if you have their office number, or it's at lunch or on the weekend or something, and you leave a voicemail that says, hi, this is so-and-so, I'm looking for a job reference for this person XYZ, but I only want you to call me back if they are an exemplary employee and you would hire them back in a minute. If they're not that way, please don't call me back. Try that, see how it works. Remember that hiring is a sales process. So if you like the person, you have to sell them on working for you, why your place is a good place to work, why they'd be a good fit, what you like about their background, etc., that brought them in for the interview. Just make sure that you don't go into the interview having already sold yourself on them and then trying to spend the rest of the interview confirming the fact that you made such a good hire. Tool number 4. When you have people who you would like to hire, maybe you have more people that interview well and that you really think would be good people, but you don't have that many positions. Or if you've offered the job to somebody and they aren't able to take it or they refuse to take it, you can make them part of your farm team. And we talked about this again in video number 2. Farm team are people who you would consider hiring again. Not that you would guarantee them a job, but you would probably guarantee them an interview. And you stay in touch with those people. So maybe every quarter you block out an hour or two on your calendar to reach out to your farm team. Send them notes, send them ideas, news about what's going on with you. Ask them how their work is going. Maybe next time you have an opening, they will be available. You can bring them in. Maybe not, but at least you're staying in touch. And that's why you don't burn bridges and you don't ghost people when they've gone through your interview process, especially if you like them and you might consider them in the future. you certainly want to, at the end of the interview, even if you didn't hire them or didn't make an offer, tell them, we really appreciate you coming in. We would like to stay in touch, even though we went in a different direction at this time. And I'll be staying in touch with you every so often. Don't be a pest about it, but keep them on your farm team. And tool number 5, these are some extra reading, and I want to bring back that quote that I said a minute ago, which is, if you're looking for good people, hiring is a full contact sport. You have to devote time to getting better at it. And these are 2 of the books that I know that are really good. This one, Who, by Jeff Smart and Randy Street. I don't know why it wasn't by Randy Street and Jeff Smart, so they could be street smart, but maybe they were streeter than I was. The other one is 45 Effective Ways for Hiring Smart by Pierre Mornell. I think you'll like both these books, and you'll get some pretty practical information from them. So thank you for your time. If you'd like a copy of this deck, please email me, and be sure to let me know which session you want the slides for, because I do so many of these. One of the things I do with companies is help them improve their hiring process. So if I can help you in any way, please reach out. It's John at ceobootcamp.com.